You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
On today's episode, we talk with sociologist Gavin Rae about some of the problems with the field of Marxist sociology pioneered by Michael Burawoy and Erik Olin. Rae argues that by rejecting Marx's idea of crisis and value, their sociology is left with a lot of problems. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. In just a moment, we'll be talking with Gavin Rae about Marxist sociology, but first, as we do in every episode, Andrew and I are going to take a few minutes to talk about some current events.
Yes, Marxist-Humanist Initiative will be holding a public discussion on Sunday, September 18, via Skype, and it's going to be on the U.S. Supreme Court's Dobbs decision and women's continuing struggle to control their lives. And this we'll be meeting between 1 and 3 p.m. East Coast time in the United States, Eastern Daylight Time. Attendance is by invitation. So if you are not a member or supporter of MHI or previously invited, you should apply, write to MHI, include a few words about yourself and your interest in a Marxist-Humanist perspective.
Today is September 7th, and for this current event section, we're going to be talking about a ruling that came down in New Mexico yesterday on the 6th. A county commissioner by the name of Couy Griffin, who has been convicted of participating in the January 6th riot, he was removed from his office as a county commissioner by a judge in New Mexico. The judge cited the 14th Amendment as grounds for barring him from ever participating in public office. This opens up the possibility that other public officials who participated in the Capitol insurrection could be removed from public office, including perhaps even Donald Trump in the future, who could be banned from running for office under the 14th Amendment.
Actually, it's extremely interesting. The 14th Amendment does not ban somebody from running for office. Okay, I didn't get to the distinction either, but I read something today about this. It bars them from holding office. Donald Trump can run and this and that, but I was reading electoralvote.com, as I often do, and they have a little piece, one insurrection and you're out. And they say, look, it's some minor official in New Mexico, but, quote, it occurs to us that other insurrectionist politicians are never going to be able to rest easy. The 14th Amendment doesn't prohibit the election of insurrectionists to office. It prohibits insurrectionists from holding office. So a person like Pennsylvania gubernatorial candidate Doug Mastriano could be targeted for a suit at any time. Oh, and since they are not being charged with a crime, per se, double jeopardy likely doesn't apply. You can't be charged twice with a crime if you've gotten off the first time in the U.S. But double jeopardy doesn't apply here because it's not a charge of a crime. So they say, so it could be a lawsuit every month or maybe even every week for these folks. Christopher Bates, who wrote this, he's not a lawyer as far as I know, but there are people who are and who've thought about this.
Interesting. The same day that this ruling by this judge in New Mexico came out, the Anti-Defamation League released a report on this Oath Keeper database leak. It's a leak of a membership list for the Oath Keepers. The Oath Keepers, of course, the far-right group whose leader was indicted for a seditious conspiracy for participating in the January 6th insurrection. The ADL did a lot of research going through the names on this database leak and seeing how many of these people were public officials or cops or military personnel. And they provide a map. You can click on each state in the country and see how many people in each state are on this membership list and how many elected officials or police officers, military personnel, etc. are on this membership list. Now, some of the people on the list who were contacted by the ADL claimed, I was never actually a member. Maybe I signed up for an email list at some point, or I used to be a member, but not anymore. So there was a real attempt to distance themselves from the Oath Keepers at this point. But I found it interesting that the same day there's one form of accountability for January 6th in the form of this county commissioner losing his job. There's also this ADL database, which is trying to out people and call people out for maybe their close relationship to far-right groups. Keepers, of course, is an organization which part of its philosophy is to infiltrate local level political offices to build parallel institutions within institutions, which is right out of a typical fascist playbook. So it's good to see that there are different forms of fight back against these types of takeover.
Well, of course, what used to be fringe is now not so fringe. But the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, they had this meeting in a parking garage on January 5th, 2021, the evening before the insurrection. I don't think all of the information has come out, but...
Yeah, the Proud Boys have also taken over the Miami-Dade Republican Party, apparently. So they're also now infiltrating and taking over Republican cells.
But these people are just, the low-level muscle. Mr. Big is sitting there in Mar-a-Lago. As long as these actions just go against these low-level people, it has some symbolic significance, but there's kind of probably a bottomless well of white supremacists and other deplorables that can be riled up by the politicians when the time comes. So what I'm hoping is that this kind of a decision that came down against Coy Griffin will be used creatively. So much of the legal actions of the liberals and the left is to go by the book, to make great legal arguments, and then have some Trumpite judge in Florida who shouldn't even be handling the case say, oh, yeah, you got to appoint a special master, ha, 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 right? I mean, everybody knows it. These people are not looking at any law. They're not judging. They don't have a different legal philosophy. They start with, here's the result that we want, and here's what we can throw together to put some mere semblance of legitimacy to it. But the fix is in everywhere. Okay, so people who don't want this have got to get really creative. If they want to deal with the law at all, be equally creative. Go after these people like they were saying on electoralvote.com. Go after them every month, maybe even every week, and they don't have to even be convicted of a crime. They just have to be part of an insurrection, or even if you look at the 14th Amendment, abetting an insurrection. And one can get very creative if you find the right judge. The right judge might buy it. If these judges get off of precedent and this and that, which don't matter anymore, you can be very creative about what it means to abet an insurrection. And if these folks don't get creative and fight fire with fire, they're just going to keep losing and losing and losing, and all of our rights are going to be gone. So if you people believe in the rule of law, you got to be creative with it.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. Up next, our conversation with Gavin Rae about the problems with the Marxist sociology of Michael Burawoy and Erik Olin Wright. We are pleased to welcome on the podcast today Gavin Rae. Gavin Rae is a sociologist living in Warsaw, Poland. He's written extensively on Poland and post-socialist capitalism there. He's a founding member of the left-wing Forward Foundation in Poland and is currently writing an intellectual biography of the Polish left-wing economist Tadeusz Kowalik. So, Gavin Rae, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I guess, Andrew, you stumbled across a paper Gavin wrote 4 years ago called The Value of Crisis. It's a paper that talks about the field of Marxist sociology and the lack of appreciation for Marxist theory of crisis within some of the key trends within that field, and tries to argue that a acknowledgement or discussion of Marxist theory of crisis would be invaluable to the development of a real Marxist sociology. And Gavin, you wrote this paper for the World Association of Political Economy conference in 2018. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
I'd like to add, what's notable is not just sociology in general is not appreciative of Marx's work on crisis, but this is coming from the left, and indeed from very noted sociologists who have or did call themselves Marxists.
So, Gavin, you mostly are discussing the contributions to Marxist sociology of Michael Burawoy and Erik, Olin, Wright. Those are probably names that a lot of people are familiar with in the Marxist left. Erik, Olin, Wright, a long-time influential analytical Marxist who rewrote the same book about class over and over again throughout his life. Michael Burawoy, who wrote about consent in the workplace. And I was less familiar with like this term sociological Marxism and their relationship to that term. So your paper was kind of introduction to that for me. Do you want to give us some context?
Yeah, I mean, actually, the idea came to me from listening to one of your podcasts. I remember it was an interview when Andrew was speaking, and he actually was talking about the issue of the falling rate of profit and the organic composition of capital and crisis. And he said when, it would be good also to look at how sociologists and in other fields and geographers and so on, how they can use and relate to this theory. And it's got me thinking of, well, how does this relate into sociology, and why have I not seen it in sociology and for Marxist sociologists? Why is this theory, which is central to Marxism, not being applied? And I sort of started to read around Marxist sociologists more within this context, and was led towards the theories and the work of Burawoy and Wright, because these are the two most distinguished leading Marxist sociologists in the English-speaking world. I mean, Burawoy, you've mentioned the different areas which he was involved in. I mean, he was president of the International Sociological Association from 2010 to 2014. Wright, who died in 2019, was the president of the American Sociological Association. These are not minor figures in sociology. And they are two people who openly described themselves as Marxists, used some Marxist terminology, and in the early 21st century began this attempt to construct what they called a sociological Marxism. It was an attempt to create a distinct discipline in sociology called sociological Marxism, which is obviously, a fairly significant event, particularly as it was being driven by two very well-known sociologists and renowned sociologists in the field. So I was drawn to this to look at it. And then when I looked at it, that they also, not in any hidden way, because often this sort of using Marxist terminology, but, straying away from some of the fundamentals of Marxism, people often do this, but they don't acknowledge it. What Burawoy and Wright do is to very openly state that they don't agree with many of the fundamental thesis of Marxism and development of Marxism. So in their work, they state a number of things about the long-term non-sustainability of capitalism. They reject this, the intensification of anti-capitalist class struggle. They reject this, and the possible and natural transition to socialism. Obviously, this is more controversial, but they also reject this. So they reject very clearly some of the fundamental theses of Marxism, and most particularly the first one about the long-term non-sustainability of capitalism, that capitalism is a system that undergoes periods of intensifying crisis and decay that undermine its possibility of reproduction. So this is the first thesis which they say. And then when you read into their work, what they say is that the labour theory of value can no longer be defended, that it's very much, Alan Freeman talks about often in economics of Marxism without Marx. And this, I think, in sociology is almost going a step further. It's almost Marxism without Marxism, because, again, they quite openly state that they are more influenced by the readings of people such as Karl Polanyi, his concepts of commodification and double movement, which are influenced by Marx, but this is their major influence. And they seem to follow the tradition of sort of Max Weber and so forth of separating society from the economy, of looking how civil society protects itself against what they call commodification, the need for an active society to protect society against commodification. Again, this is sort of drawn from Polanyi and so forth. And so it was through this reading of this which I became interested in this. What does it mean that they claim these theses about the long-term non-sustainability of capitalism, for example, that this cannot be sustained anymore, that they reject the labour theory of value, they reject the idea of the falling rate of profit based upon the rising organic composition of capital, etc., etc. What happens if this isn't true? What happens if they're wrong on this? Particularly as their attempt of sociological Marxism really stalled. I mean, they were doing this in the first half of the 2000s, and they sort of, after a number of attempts, it was meant to lead to a book. They dropped this. They sometimes sort of said this was because of other commitments and so on. But really, what I would argue that it sort of hit a dead end very much, because events, I mean, maybe at the beginning of 2000s, you could hold on to this theory that capitalism is going to crisis. From 2007-8 onwards, this is an extremely hard position to maintain. So really the thesis they were laying out and so on was proven wrong by events, and meant that this idea of creating a sociological Marxism failed, essentially. And so it was from this perspective which I started to write this paper and to look at this subject.
This is very interesting, because this was one of my questions when reading your paper. Is this project termed sociological Marxism belongs to a particular phase, and then it ended and they went on to somewhat other things. You quote or cite where Burawoy became interested in other things, and so they dropped it. But it was clear from reading your paper that you thought that they were caught in a trap that they had created by predicting crisis-free, stable, managed capitalism just a few years before everything blew up and the Great Recession came along. Is there anything in their work that indicates that their sociological Marxism project ran into theoretical difficulty because of the events of the Great Recession, and that they would have to revise it in some manner?
I mean, they don't revise it. And again, I have to say, I have a sociologist. These are people you have to have a certain respect for. They've done working on class and different things they've done with Burawoy. And I remember Burawoy's work in Eastern Europe, for example, which I'm interested in, is extremely important. When he was working in Hungarian factories during communism, and he was in Russia at the end of communism, and had a very kind of harsh critique of a transition and so forth. So these are people who I have in many areas respect for, but they don't really revise this. They don't go back to it. What you see them increasingly doing is moving away from the area of the economy. And this again comes back to this sort of influence of Weberianism within sociology, which separates the society from the economy. There's also the influence of neoclassical economics into sociology. So neoclassical sociology, which is influential through sociologists such as Parsons and so forth, which believes that there is a certain equilibrium within society, stability in society, when there is disorder, but this is something unusual, and so on. What they do, they're essentially drawn into this sort of hegemony within theoretical sociology. They obviously have a strong critique of capitalism or the effects of capitalism, but what they term commodification is destructive in many social areas of society, and they're very critical of this. But they essentially believe that capitalism has stabilized. That, it will go through difficulties and there are social disorders which it creates, but the idea that capitalism is going to reach serious difficulties in its economic and social reproduction has been proven to be false. And so what they move towards is to looking at, well, if this is true, if the economy is essentially going to maintain itself in long-term periods of stability, then we have to look outside of the economic fields to society and alternatives which exist within it. So really what Wright does, for example, is I think he is the one which I think probably moves away from this project of sociological Marxism, and starts to look at what they call real utopias. So, as there is no particular threat to capitalism from within itself, the internal contradictions of capitalism, we have to look for things outside of it. We have to look for real utopias, as they call it, within society, which will not replace capitalism as a system. It will create areas within capitalism which are autonomous of it. This is, looking for alternatives outside of the economic realm, because there is stability in this.
Right. Just to make sure all of our listeners are following this, this has been Gavin summarizing Erik Olin Wright's position. He has not been speaking about his own thinking right now. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. so for example, Wright talks about, he did a whole project and in his later life about this real utopias, looking for alternatives within the capitalist system, areas of social life which are not commodified. So he identifies things such as urban participatory budgeting, workers-owned cooperatives, even Wikipedia, which is kind of absurd when we know how Wikipedia exists. But it's, areas which are supposed to exist outside of the commodified relations. This is very popular within sociology. You can look at this idea of where areas within capitalism are not affected by this commodified relationship. So you look at Esping Anderson and his theories on the welfare state. You look at people such as Pierre Bourdieu, his whole kind of emphasis is upon looking at parts of social life which are not supposedly run primarily due to commodified relations. He didn't actually use the word commodified, but he was more about economic capital, as he described it. I mean, some of this is interesting, some of this is interesting stuff, and so on and so forth. But as a general theory of being Marxism into sociology, they were led into a dead end, and they had to more or less drop their attempt to construct a Marxist sociology. Remember, after 2008, they had previously been saying that this sort of period of intensifying crisis was in the past and that capitalism didn't undergo these deep periods of crisis and depressions anymore. After 2007-8, they had to sort of try to sort of work out why it was that this crisis had occurred. So there is, I found some speech in where provides a sort of underconsumptionist explanation for the economic crisis. Wright says, yes, this is an extremely serious crisis, but it shouldn't threaten capitalism systematically as a system. So they sort of are forced to try to explain it, but they don't do this in any systemic way. And they certainly don't go back to the fundamentals of Marxist sociologists and try to readdress this and explain why it is that what they had predicted was wrong and what this actually means for Marxism within sociology.
So you've talked about how living in a period of capitalist history, which was relatively crisis-free, may have contributed to Burawoy and Wright and others generating theories that focused on stability and rejected notions of crisis. But they're also, if they're going to be doing Marxist sociology, there needs to be some theoretical justification as well for jettisoning Marxist crisis theory. It can't just be, well, crisis isn't happening now because crises are cyclical, right? So what was their theoretical justification for jettisoning Marx's theory of crisis?
I mean, this is to their credit as well. They do go back into the fundamentals of Marxist crisis theory, and in their papers, they directly start talking about the theory of Marx of the rising organic composition of capital and the falling rate of profit. Wright is somebody that has written for a longer period on the issues of capitalist crisis and stuff, going back into the crisis of capitalism in the mid-1970s. At this time, Wright argued that there was no empirical evidence showing that the organic composition of capital had risen. He claimed that this was rather a feature of early industrial capitalism, as later investments tended to be in capital-saving rather than labour-saving technologies.
And when you say this time, you mean in 2007?
Well, no, this is going back to the 70s. This is going back to the debates around, the economic crisis in the mid-1970s.
Class Crisis in the State, is that his book?
Exactly. This is a book which goes through this. He goes through the different Marxist capitalist theories of crisis. And the first one he talks about is this theory of the rising organic composition of capital. And he says that, this was true in early capitalism, this theory of Marx, but in later capitalism, this is not true as investments tend to be in capital saving rather than labor saving technologies. These are the fastest growing sections of the economy, such as services, which are more labor intensive than industrial production. So this is his argument at this point. His view was that this would be something which will continue, and that increasingly that as investments will be less capital investments and the growing areas of the economy will become more labor intensive. This is his theory. Now, this is shown to be wrong over the last few decades. As economies develop, so capital inputs as a proportion of GDP rise relative to labor inputs, meaning that capital-intensive growth tends to replace labor-intensive growth. And then in the 2000s, they come back to this again. The early 2000s, in their joint paper of Wright and Burawoy, again, they say that Marx's predictions of crisis have been proved wrong, and this is due to flaws in the labour theory of value. Again, repeating Wright's theory, Wright's predictions of capital-intensive investment, etc., etc. What Wright predicts in the mid-1970s, you have this crisis, the rising of the price of oil, and etc., etc. And what he says in the 1970s is that what will happen is the state will return and begin to invest in the economy. What he believed is that this would reduce the crisis tendencies within capitalism, which can be shown, for example, the competition within the capitalist economy, in the world capitalist economy, which leads towards these crisis tendencies, will be reduced because of state intervention. This will also take up what they call effective demand. I mean, they're close to the sort of a monthly review monopoly school theory of capitalist crisis. And they believe that by capitalist investments in the economy will fill the demand gap of effective demand. And again, Burawoy writes about this, that he's following the sort of work of Sweezy and Baran and so on and so forth. Wright is predicting in the 70s that the state intervention will lead capitalism away from crisis. And he also says that it will increase the parts of the economy and society which are not being run according to the laws of commodity production, of commodification. So he believes that this is going to lead to sort of state-managed capitalism, which will be stable and avoid these periods of crisis and depressions. The increase of state investment will prevent the destructive competitive competition between individual capitalists and imbalance between sectors and so on and so forth. So they're going in this direction, sociology, which we know within areas of Marxist economics. In their Sociological Marxism paper in the 2000s, state that this has been, what we have shown is that, first of all, empirically, capitalism isn't reaching crisis like it did before. And theoretically, the predictions of Marx of the rising organic composition of capital leading to the falling rate of profit has been proven to be internally inconsistent and should be rejected. And this means that we need to create a new form of Marxist sociology. And this was where I start to write about this, saying, well, first of all, I would say that empirically this hasn't been shown to be true. And all of the later debates within Marxism, including the TSSI school and so on and so forth, have also, I don't go into this in the paper, I don't go into the details of this debate, but in a sense, I accept the TSSI explanation as showing the consistency of Marxist theory and the Marxist theory of crisis based upon the rising organic composition of capital.
Gavin mentioned the Occhio theorem and the TSSI, which stands for the temporal single system interpretation. We've discussed both concepts on the podcast in the past. Maybe we should even link to those in the podcast description, so if people need more background on those, they should. But the temporal single system interpretation, which Andrew has had a big part of developing, is a interpretation of Marxist value theory, which shows that Marxist value theory and his theory of crisis can be read in a way which is internally consistent, and shows that the Occhio theorem was a theorem that claimed to show that Marx's theory of crisis, of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, was internally inconsistent. The TSSI refutes the Occhio theorem, to be brief. But these ideas that there is a way of reading Marx which renders his value theory consistent, which renders his theory of crisis consistent, those ideas have had a real struggle to gain acceptance in a lot of fields of Marxist economics, and I assume also Marxist sociology, since I hear a lot of the themes that you're talking about, Gavin. I'm familiar with hearing those themes in like the regulation school, the social structure of accumulation school, like the David Harvey camp, the monthly review school, a lot of these same themes, which are based around this idea of like a stable state-managed capitalism, and which all in some form reject Marxist theory of crisis. I wonder if you have a sense of like TSSI, which is, I want to say new, but it's even not that new, all right? I mean, it's been around for decades. Have there been defections in sociology from this notion of Marx's failed crisis theory? Have there been defections from this Okishio-centered sociology over the years, or is that still like the reigning paradigm for doing Marx's sociology?
I mean, there hasn't been. This is again when I started to read this work of Burawoy and Wright. When I looked around and tried to find other stuff, has anyone else sort of critiqued this? I almost expected to find a sort of literature on this, of at least some sort of critique, because the main thesis of their paper was so obviously, at least empirically and theoretically, questionable. And I couldn't really find anything on this. I mean, what again, it comes back to the sort of Weberian sociology, because what Weber believed was that what capitalism was based upon was rationality. What differentiated capitalism from previous systems? Previous economic systems are based upon, this is according to Max Weber, upon tradition, whereas capitalism is a rational system. And this is what makes it different to other economic systems. This is obviously very questionable. That first of all, in previous systems, that they weren't rational in their behavior, it was rational in different conditions, and also that capitalism is a rational system where we know that a large part of production is irrational. But what Max Weber believed is that as so-called sort of technological rationality of capitalism developed, and you have a growth of large corporations and organizations, and bureaucracy becomes strong within society, you have this sort of dehumanized sort of stability within capitalism. And this has been taken by other areas of Marxism, like the Frankfurt School, particularly are influenced by this. So they're believing what I call in the paper, it's like a utopian dystopia, because they paint a picture of capitalism. It's stable, it's lasting, it doesn't go through periods of crisis and so forth. Although it's inhuman, yeah? We're being controlled by technology and scientific rationality. There's little room for critical human thought and expression and so on and so forth. So it's a critique of capitalism, but within a capitalism which is stable, although has a lack of human creativity and critical thinking, etc., and so forth. So this is very much taken and accepted by large parts of Marxist sociology, which I would say is not Marxist sociology. It's essentially Weberian sociology. Now, when we look at, as you were saying, what are there any sort of breaks away from this within Marxist sociology? I mean, when just by doing a literature review, and maybe some listeners know of critiques which I haven't found myself, but certainly in the English language speaking world, I mean, it's very little. I mean,
on this issue of the refutation of the myth of inconsistency and disproof of the Okishio theorem gaining any traction in sociology, in the experience that I've had, it's gone in the other direction. The powers that be are very good at manufacturing consent, as it were. I knew somebody who was a graduate student in Erik Olin Wright's graduate program, a sociology grad student. And he said, well, the temporal single system interpretation has disproven what you're saying about internal inconsistency and so forth. And Wright did not defend his claim that Marx's value theory is inconsistent. He said, well, assuming you're right, well, where would that get us? In the end, this person who's now a teaching sociologist got his PhD with Wright as his advisor about 8 years ago. That's how it ended up. And so, I mean, I think one reason that this doesn't gain traction is because the powers that be have the power to prevent that. But second of all, sociologists seem not to be able to really handle the nuts and bolts of this in the main. So even someone like Erik Olin Wright, I mean, he uses this as a trope, but I think that the anecdote I just told you indicates that he really couldn't, when push came to shove, back up his claims. So the way this stuff plays out in sociology is more not in terms of the technical economics, but these are themes that get used in service of a certain purpose, it seems to me.
Again, it's the kind of Weberian, which is essentially a neoclassicalism within sociology. I mean, I was going a long way back, when I was at university and so forth. You were taught, well, almost as it was obvious that this sort of Marxist theory, the real nuts and bolts of Marxism and labour theory of value and the theory of crisis, this was so obviously just been proved wrong. But what you could keep from Marx was this idea of the sort of dehumanising elements of capitalism, the alienation, but not the actual, not really Marxism, but just parts on the side. And this is exactly what Burawoy and Wright do. They make this very clear on this, that they're moving away from production to the market. They're rejecting the labour theory of value. Their main influence is Karl Polanyi and his theory of commodification and the double movement.
I have a question about this whole double movement and the commodification and everything. And you were talking about it earlier, and it seems to me that what the whole double movement of Polanyi is about, and what Burawoy and Wright and others glommed onto, is this idea that there's somehow a split between economy and society, that these are two separate realms. And you talked about looking for things within society that are not capitalistic. And you mentioned, like, this just abandons not only Marx, but Marxism. And I was thinking, yeah, what does it abandon? And to me, what came to mind was in the introduction to the Grundrisse, Marx says, capital is the all-dominating power of modern society. The all-dominating power of modern society, and so there is no split where there's the economy over here, which is rational choice thinking, as opposed to something called society over there with its traditions and norms and so forth. And they're in a battle. And that's basically what, correct me if I'm mistaken, Polanyi's double movement seems to me to be a battle, is that what we would today call the neoliberals, which were back then called the liberals, the pro-market types, they really, went to town in the 19th century. And that, however, the deregulation, all of the turning of society into more and more market-oriented stuff, that destabilized society, that threatened society. And so what happened is society reacted. You had the reaction from, like, the landlord class, you had the reaction from the working class, but in the end, despite their differences, landlords and workers, these are coming from society. So there was the fight back of society to protect itself. And for me, this is just makes me more appreciative of Maggie Thatcher when she says there is no such thing as society. But as a sociologist, how do you react to that?
Yeah, that's a good quote, because we always attack this quote normally. But in some ways where society is put up to such a level outside of the economy, maybe there's some truth in it. Because if you take the element of Marx in Polanyi, then it's essentially the idea that greater areas of life are reduced to its exchange value, which destroys its use value. This is the sort of essence of it. Now, you can see that in Marx, in the way Marx talks about this, how capitalism destroys the base of its own reproduction. And this is sort of the Polanyian idea. And therefore, he also has this theory of the fictitious commodities. So there are certain things, again, this is Polanyi's idea, if something has been created as a commodity, then that is a commodity. But some things have existed before and have been turned into commodities. And he calls these fictitious economies. He says money, land, and labour are the three commodities. And as they get more and more commodified within capitalist development, then this destroys the use value of these. And society pushes back, according to Polanyi, and this creates the sort of social conditions for the market to survive. This is, again, you can see some elements of Marx in there, but this is also very much situated within Weber, the idea of the role of the state and regulating the market and so forth, which is central within Weber, and also within Emil Durkheim, one of the other great founders of sociology, who talked about the sort of the social underpinnings of the market, the necessary for the market to be embedded in society. And this has been very influential in parts of sociology, like Granovetter's theory of networks, and many theories are looking at how the market has to be embedded, has to be socially embedded in order to survive. What happens with Burawoy and Wright is they take this idea, and again, it's exactly as you said, it's separating the society from the economy. It comes to the real utopias as well. What we have to do is to find ways of creating boundaries around areas of social life which would protect these against the encroachments of the market. Burawoy writes about this. Information was one of these things he's talking about that needs to be protected, and areas of autonomy within the internet and so on and so forth have to be protected and push back against this commodification. What this does as well, it completely leaves out any concept of exploitation within production. It leaves this out completely. There's no mention of this. And it moves, again, they say this very straightforwardly, it means that you move out of production into exchange. This is the focus we have to look at. So Marx looked at the crisis tendencies based within production and so on and so forth. This has been proven to be false, according to Burawoy and Wright. And now we're looking at the areas of how society is protecting itself against this encroachment, against turning parts of life into exchange, into commodified relations. Now, Burawoy as well, he writes an article in Sociological Marxism where he takes this theory of Polanyi and he also uses Gramsci. He says that Gramsci was the same. Gramsci was the same as Burawoy. Gramsci was interested in exchange and the market and not on production. This is just wrong. I mean, I'm not saying it's a lie, it's just false. One of Gramsci's most famous pieces on modern capitalism in his time, in the 1920s, in the Prison Notebook, is on American capitalism and Fordism.
And Fordism is a reference to Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company, right? So it's about production.
And the Fordist system of production, Gramsci is very clear on this. He says fascism is the ultimate stage of capitalism, which is attempting to overcome the long-term tendency for the rate of profit to fall. He saw that also Fordism, this sort of rationalization of production, lowering of production costs, etc., was an answer to this, an attempt to overcome these contradictions. And he writes within this note on Americanism and Fordism, the whole of social life now revolves around production, and that the structure has gained dominance over the superstructure. So I'm not sure where Burawoy got this from. I mean, it's just a complete misreading or lack of reading of Gramsci's.
Yeah, I thought that was a very strong aspect of your paper. It's rather short, but it's decisive. But what kind of blew my mind is Burawoy, who spent God knows how many weeks, over how many years in factories here, there, everywhere in the world, how he could just so blithely move from, production's not important to markets are important.
I can't explain it. I don't want to come up with some psychological explanation or something. I can't explain why.
Hey, we're going to return to this conversation in just a moment, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes to hear from Andrew Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing and all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist-Humanism. Please join us.
So, Gavin, your paper tries to make a case to sociology about what kind of insights might be garnered by Marx's production-centered theory of value and crisis seriously, looking at sociology through that lens. Maybe you can give us, our listeners, a little bit of a taste of some of those insights. Like, for instance, you talk about the fragmentation and intensification of work. How does that, relate to Marx?
I mean, if we take it from Gramsci again. I mean, what Gramsci was saying in the early 20th century, leading into fascism, was that within this Fordist system of production, that there is a socialization of workers and society into this new mode of production. So capitalism attempts to subject to human natural instincts and desires to the norms of and habits of order, discipline, mechanical repression, workers working in large factories and so forth, of having to carry out repetitive, disciplined, mechanical work. So this creates a very much staid moral order of disciplined, routine workers within factory production. And this is obviously maintains a part for a large number of workers in the world today. Because what we have in the contradiction of capitalism is we accept the idea of the rising organic composition of capital, which then creates disequilibrium, disorder and crisis, because this is the sort of contradiction you have. Now it's one where we see these rising technologies on different technologies now within the internet and so forth, and networked productions and so on and so forth. Now it's one where it increasingly creates a sort of atomized worker, a worker which is expected to survive and compete in increasingly competitive and unstable work environment, where your social and personal life is undergoing perpetual change and disorder. As I said, this has been recognized by other sociologists, and this isn't something new, this idea of anxiety, burnouts and so forth. The Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman has written a large amount of this without relating it to the Marxist theory, so forth. It's a form of alienation, which of course comes out of the labour theory of value, this alienation of increased, probably the major contradiction of our times in a way, or one of the major contradictions of the social world in capitalism, where we have a rising of scientific advances in technology, surrounded more and more by this technology, which should be able to free us and free our time up more and make life easier and more enjoyable, but also are increasingly in reality becoming tools which are disciplining us into work, are making us new forms of work which are round the clock and 24/7, new forms of exploitation, contributing to these new sort of social disorders of anxiety, burnout, illnesses, disorders, and so on and so forth. So this is this inverse relationship between humans and technology. And as this sort of technologies and for which are being developed, which should, you would hope, be creating a world which is more stable, more order, it's creating more disorder. And I think this contradiction, I mean, in my article, I sort of just tried to point to areas which could be interesting for sociological research, which comes out of Marx's theory of crisis.
Yeah, I think your paper makes a good case for why a lot of the modern relationship between work and technology and the way technology has transformed our work lives and the blurring of work and home life and all those angles, how a lot of those could really benefit from a sociology that is production-centered and looks at these phenomena through a lens informed by Marx's crisis theory, his theory of value. We can't really cover all the points you made in your paper here, but we'll, of course, link to it so people can read it for themselves. Maybe sociologists listening will be inspired to do some of this work. I definitely think there's a parallel between what you're describing here in sociology and what we described a few months ago in a podcast when we were discussing the ecological Marxism of John Bellamy Foster and the Monthly Review School and their concept of metabolic rift. The issue that they face is they're trying to theorize a concept of ecological crisis that is not centered in capitalist production because they have this notion of stability that's essential to the Monthly Review School. And so they're trying to theorize crisis on the edges of capitalist production, which is a really difficult task because it's capitalist production that's driving the ecological crisis, right? But they have to find it at the intersection of capital and the non-capital world in this primitive accumulation. Anyway, they have this theory that's, to the extent that there is ecological crisis that's explained by their theory, it's a very peripheral and type of crisis that's not the central environmental issues over time, like climate change or a species extinction, So they have this issue where, to the extent that they're describing anything at all, it's peripheral, but they use that peripheral explanation to try to act like it describes everything, right? And I feel that's kind of what you're saying about sociology. It's it's not that commodification, decommodification are things that don't exist as issues, but they're not the central issues in capitalism. The role of technology, the revolutionizing of technology and its effect on production and work and our experience of work, and how in a modern world our work extends into our personal lives and our homes, and we carry our supercomputer in our pocket all the time in the form of they call it a phone, but it's really like a time card that you're punching all the time, right? You're punching into work in the middle. You wake up at 2 a.m, you check your work emails. So there's this sense of the production process permeating all of your personal life, and then all the disorder and alienation of modern life that comes along with that way of that technology and it permeates life. That seems to describe a lot of the real essence of what a sociology should be looking at. Whereas, yeah, you could talk about commodification, but that seems kind of a peripheral concern. And so it's this way of taking these peripheral things, but treating them as if they can explain the real meat of things. That is one of the mistakes that happens. And that's maybe it comes from just the Weberian tradition or reading Polanyi, but also maybe from this people's inability to accept the fact that this whole paradigm of stability, this whole monthly review, regulation theory, sense of stability and of capitalist production is a really flawed starting point for building a theory, whether it's a ecological theory or an economic theory or a sociological theory. They run into the same dead ends.
This is essentially what I'm kind of penciled in this article and think is the areas which need to be explored. And I've outlined a couple of these in the second part of the text, because this competitive nature of capitalism, etc. If we were to accept the sort of monthly review, monopoly school thesis, which has been taken by Burawoy and Wright and so forth, then there's no real internal logical reason why we would have this continual drive to create these new technologies, to replace old technologies with new ones, going away from this Weberian separation of society and economy, and taking away this acceptance of a form of stability and order within the capitalist system, and actually going back to Marx and looking at how these processes within production affect our social lives and social relations. I think this is it's not the only thing that can be done in sociology, but it's an area, if you're going to do Marxist sociology, this is an area returning Marx into Marxist sociology and offers up areas for fruitful research which have often been neglected.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of comments, not really on the details of what Gavin is saying, but just this Polanyian turn among these folks in sociology. I find it very worrisome. First of all, I'm reminded by, Gavin saying that their predictions prior to the Great Recession, the capitalism had stabilized, that all blew up in their face. But the track record of Polanyi in general has not been great. Polanyi himself, when he wrote The Great Transformation, and, in that period, he was fully expecting the end of market society and the takeover of, the advanced world by either the USSR, or fascism. So things didn't go in that way. And I think that's something we need to get behind. But the other thing is, it seems to me that what is driving a lot of this stuff, the return to Polanyi, is a political project. And it's a political project that's basically a populist turn on the left. You get the whole anti-neoliberal left. When you look at the ideology, it's coming from Polanyi, mediated through people like Nancy Fraser, a philosopher in the U.S. And when you say, well, there's a double movement, there's the neoliberals, there's the free market people, and then there's society's reaction. The way Polanyi had it was the reaction of the landlords and the workers, who somehow were on the same side. Well, the modern expression of that is, all the progressive people and the workers are against this, and then there's all the Trumpite, the middle class, the people who have their own small businesses and so forth, and no matter how reactionary they are, they're not these neoliberal types either, and we can make common cause with them, and we can appeal to them. We're all together against the corporations and against neoliberalism and so forth. I find it very worrisome, and there's got to be something really wrong when a Marxist theorist of class like Erik Olin Wright gets reduced to this person who is talking about, the reaction of society undifferentiated in terms of class against markets and so forth. Something has seriously gone wrong. That's my view.
Well, I think this has been a great discussion. So, Gavin Rae, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to join.
Thanks for coming and speaking with us, Gavin.
Hey, that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to listen to other episodes and to read more about these issues and others. As always, if you like the podcast, we encourage you to write to us, to comment and rate the podcast, and of course to share with all your friends and enemies.